Hello and welcome to the Eskrima podcast. My name is Jason Inay and I am an Inayan Eskrimador. So I wanted to continue on with yesterday's podcast with regards to the elements of reaction time. Yesterday we spoke about awareness and that's like the first stage and everything. And the next one is perception. So we want to talk about this from the point of view of how we train for it, how we can attack that stage, how it should shape the way that we train and strategize. So, but before that, I have to ask you if you liking the posts and or rather the show, please like, comment, and share. Otherwise, let's get to it. So, awareness, perception, analysis, strategy, and execution, right? And then I correlated that towards the TOTE model as well as the OODA loop. But perception, it's an interesting thing. Like it goes back to awareness to a degree where, if you can't perceive the attack, right, then you really can't defend against it. That's where unorthodoxy really is a huge advantage. You see these pro fighters that, they come up with a new move, or they have a new skill with every fight. They change some way, they evolve in some way, so that their opponents do not have the expectation of behavior that this superlative fighter presents. So the other part of it too is, how in our training, how do we negate that? How do we make a student, more aware, a practitioner more suited for or prepared for different kinds of attacks, and then how can we attack perception, right, if you will? So perception is, very simply the ability to see or sense and interpret what they're seeing or sensing as a particular kind of attack. This isn't exclusively just visual, right? So if you're familiar with any sticky hand techniques, sensitivity exercises or techniques, then you'll fully understand this. Grapplers have to use this a lot, and close quarters, empty hands have to use tactile perception as opposed to visual perception in order for them to be able to interpret a movement. Likewise, the consummate fighter is going to be able to visually interpret certain nonverbal cues that indicate an attack prior to the attack's launch. All of this comes down to perception. So, one of the things I notice with students, intermediate to advanced especially, is the desire to move on from a particular drill or exercise or even just a basic technique. And the reason why usually is because they feel like they've got the drill or exercise. And they probably do. They have, the ability to execute said technique or drill in a fluid manner, do it accurately, do it on time. So their technique, their timing, and their fluidity are on point. And that's great. So then they want to move on to the next thing. This is not true necessarily of those who fight in any way, whether it's just, like competition to actually, center stage kinds of competitions. They may or may not be paid, right? But generally competitive martial artists, and to a degree performance martial arts, although the perception element doesn't really apply to them, they tend to repeat and repeat and repeat, not to the point where they got the technique, but until they can't do the technique anyway but correct, right? It's like, I don't do this until I've learned it, I do it until I've perfected it kind of mentality. And that's great, right? The thing that they might be gaining, and the thing that I am trying to help my students obtain when I'm teaching them, or prescribing a drill for the organization internationally, is for you to get to the point where you're no longer having considerations to where you put your hands or your feet, or when you step, or when you parry or block, or just the simple rudimentary elements of any drill, whether basic or quite advanced, right? Is you can begin to watch your partner and see the movements that indicate what they're supposed to be doing in that drill, the precursors, if you will. And being able to perceive those things allows you to respond not to the attack itself, but the fomenting of that attack, the gathering of that attack. When you watch a cat get ready to pounce, you could wait as the mouse for the cat to pounce and then try to move fast. You could also perceive the gathering, the way that they scoot their body back, and they kind of wiggle, if you will, right? They get low and they move back a little bit and they gather themselves like loading a spring. That's the precursor for them to do their pounce. They don't always do it, but they don't pounce when the target moves, because their position no longer is viable. Being able to time that when it comes to a punch, when your opponent pumps their hands and they'll lift them up and drop them real quick before they punch, maybe the way that they bunch up their shoulder, maybe the way that they shift their weight, all these little things that go into perception, right? And perceiving those things as they come. If you can do that before they load their strike and launch their strike, you have a much better chance. Right? So perception is a really important part of being able to react. And the better you are at perceiving, the shorter your reactionary gap can be, meaning that you can be closer, that you can be more in what some people might call the pocket, right? The other side of it is that if I understand that my opponent is perceiving my attack as the attacker, I might change my behaviors in order to manipulate their sense of perception, right? This is going to be important for an opponent that is able to read attacks as they come, right? So, and faking is essentially, or feinting is essentially what people do in order to attack at the level or the stage of perception. There's in Filipino martial arts, the different systems will use different striking patterns. They'll use different angles of attack. They might number the angles differently, or they might have completely different angles than the typical for the numbers, right? And that's normal. In my classes, frequently I'll teach seminar segments, especially where we'll use 3 or 4 or 5 different five angle patterns, right, from different systems. So within the Inayan System of Eskrima, angle 1 through 5 is very different between the Largamano and all the other styles, really, right? The Illustrissimo Kali striking pattern as well has a different sequencing after angle 1. My father always used to say angle 1, angle 3, and angle 5 tend to be the most common lines, and then there's a variance for 2 and 4, and that's true for the most part. And then there are angle systems that are wildly different. Those angle systems are useful not for the attacker. For the attacker, it's going to be more about how I recover my tool after I strike, right? How I reload to prep for the next strike, right? And then like what my intention is for that attack, and what kind of target group, what effect am I trying to create, right? And that's slightly predicated or almost entirely predicated upon the tool that's being used as well. So there's a whole lot to think about on the angle side for the attacker. But from the defender's point of view, I need that number system because it's a quick, easy way for me to define attacks, so that way when I perceive the attack coming, right, I can begin to understand the nature of that attack, maybe even move on to the stage of analysis as to the effectiveness, the reach, target group that they might be attacking, etc., what effect they might try to be making. So as the attacker, I'll have to use faking or feinting, a deception, in order to manipulate the person's perception, because the opponent's easily reading the attacks. And so I can use that reading of the attack, that perception, if the person, my opponent, responds too soon and I'm not fully committed to that action, I can quickly change direction. And so this is where perception and technique intersect. A properly timed technique will prevent wasted movement, which makes some kinds of deception less effective, right? It's funny, like I've been in a number of scuffles as a bouncer, and it's almost as if, especially if you train, these my experiences in Eskrima versus training solely empty hand, training with a stick, training with a knife, whatever, sword. As that person loads up that angle one, because it's almost always an angle one, you see the gather of the tool, you see the shift of the weight, you see and perceive those things, and it's easy to circumvent them, right? Simply because you see it. Most of the time in bar fights, your opponent isn't sophisticated enough to truly use deception well, and whether they're drunk or sober, they're still dangerous. They're very easy to defend against in a lot of ways if you know what you're seeing, and that's what perception is, right? You're able to perceive what it is. It's an extremely important element within the elements of reaction time. It has a very apparent effect on your own reaction time as the defender perceiving the opponent. And then there's that next stage, right? The next stage of perception is really being able to perceive the overall tactic or strategy of your opponent, right? If you're perceiving the zone that they prefer, if you're perceiving the method of defense that they prefer or tend to use, if you're perceiving the typical attacks, if you're perceiving the way that they use their center of balance, which predicates what kind of attack they can do. Stance will vary from martial art to martial art, but tend to be very similar for striking arts. Their hand positioning and things will be different, right? The probably the most glaring differences is a traditional Muay Thai position versus, say, I don't know, Kempo position, right? The street fighters position versus the barroom brawler who's just wild, versus someone who's somewhat trained at boxing versus someone who's truly trained at boxing. Their stances and positions are very different, and being able to perceive that will help anticipate the nature of your opponent, and that's also important, as we move to a higher level with the use of, or the understanding of perception and its place in the elements of reaction time, and how it should dictate your training, how it should influence your training, influence your approach to the fight, right? So we can't discount enough how important it is not only to be aware and paying attention, but to be able to perceive what's happening, right? It's important from the point of view, and this moves really into analysis, but it bears conversation early on, right? In that, if I have a full understanding of my reach and my movement, and I can understand my opponent well enough by glance, by sight, without having a need for them to strike or me to strike, and for us to test the waters, if you will, if I can perceive their effective range, that's going to reduce their threat range, right, to what their actual effective range is. What I mean by that is, if you watch people fight, one person might be responding or reflexively, like flinching or moving to movements or positioning of their opponent, that's very poorly calibrated, right? So the threat range reaches beyond the effective range of that person that's attacking. So the person moves and you move too much, right? Now, if you're fully calibrated, you can skirt the line, right, and be at a position that is just barely within or just barely outside of reach, right? And that's important for us, because controlling that, especially if our opponent can't perceive that well, is going to allow us to leverage or take advantage of a misfired blow that's out of position and just a little too far, and then be able to immediately capitalize on that because we've properly perceived or accurately perceived their effective range, and therefore have a better assessment of where their true threats are, right? So perception is this amazingly important piece, and we don't really talk about it in a lot of martial arts schools. You go to the school and maybe they're doing like what they might call cover defenses. This is typical Kempo terminology, Kaji Kempo terminology, in which the attacker is fighting from a covered position, or rather you're defending from a covered position, right? So your hands are up in some kind of fighting stance, some kind of defensive, offensive position. In Eskrima, we call these guards, right? And we look at that position and we begin to perceive its there's only so many attacks you can do from any one given position. So once we have that, we only have to prepare for a limited number of possible attacks. There are going to be a number of possible attacks that they can do that might be outside of the scope that you're prepping for, simply because they take too much load anyways, right? As an example, though it's easier to say than do, generally speaking, I don't really need to prep for a rear leg side kick. I don't. And the reason why is because the load for that side kick is going to be a lot longer than the lead leg front snap kick. It just comes out there a lot slower because of the preparatory movement in order to chamber the leg and then fire that leg. And in the same sense, if I'm positioned to strike from a backhand high position, whether it be a blade or a baston, a stick, a baton, right? And I'm set in that position, unless I'm particularly savvy, you as a defender don't really need to prep as much for forehand attacks as you do backhand attacks. And that will, in turn, influence your own positioning, right? And I, as the attacker, should be able to perceive that and then come up with a countermeasure. It's kind of like a part of that element of when you watch those traditional Japanese swords techniques, movies, whatever, where the two samurai are just staring at each other from across 10 or 15 feet or more, and they're just staring at each other. Their blades are bare, they're in position, and then they just look at each other. And then one will come to attention essentially and bow, right? As if the fight is done, and, you know, concede the fight. This idea that they know that no matter what they do, positionally speaking, the other opponent is completely prepared, right? Makes it for, you know, it makes it inadvisable to attack. You know, blade work is different than empty hand work. You know, I can throw a punch that may or may not hit, and I may or may not receive a counter blow, and it may land, and I can still fight. This is very common. We see this in every pro fight, you know, where each combatant or competitor is receiving attacks from the opponent that are not fully or at all defended against. Blade, that's a missing hand, a grievous wound to the torso that you won't come back from, right? Or worse, right? So perception is this element of the reaction time that allows us to develop tactics and strategies and employ them before an attack even happens, which is that higher level of perception. The low level is you're able to perceive the attack and receive it, defend against it, deflect it, and otherwise mitigate it, and then counter, right? Or reposition. So when we look at the elements of reaction time, when we think about that in terms of the reactionary gap and how it affects it, the other side that we could think about in relationship to those two sets of ideas is, if my opponent is unable to perceive my attacks accurately, my threat range increases, their reactionary gap increases. And if I can perceive that, then I'll bridge the gap first before I do the attack, and give it to the point where the opponent does not have enough space and therefore not enough time to deal with my attacks. So maybe you see the logic in this after listening to this, of how perception works, how it affects reactionary gap, right, and your necessary reactionary time, or rather reaction time that you need, the gap or space that you need due to your highly acute or complete lack of perception in certain circumstances, right? And then hopefully you can see how the astute combatant, the Eskrimador, can look at that, experience that, and move forward and begin to, almost like magic, anticipate the opponent's movements and their position, reasonably predict the possible things that they can do in defense and attack, and assemble some kind of strategy. When we move up to that higher level again, as I continue to talk in circles here about how once I have that full perception and I can raise it to a higher level, now we move into this game of position, which there's a drill that I teach for advanced Sarada called Sabon, and we talk about these things. We used to do this drill when my father was around, and then under my uncle Frank, Master Mangisursuro Defenti, he likes to do this drill with the students too. It's the stalking drill, which we now call Sabon, and that works on perception and position, right? And once we bridge that gap, maybe we're really super close quarters in Sarada, maybe it's Kadena D'Amato, maybe you're doing Wing Chun, or maybe you're just good at Chi Sao or push hands, Tai Chi push hands, right? And it's as much visual, if not more so, tactile in what you're perceiving and how you're behaving. Because that whole other step of sticky hand, close quarters, trapping comes into play, and now you're relying not only on your sense of vision, but you're also relying on your sense of touch, right? And training your ability to perceive those things. And so, I might say at the end of this, as we come to a conclusion, I get it. I'm like this too, where I just want to move to the next drill. I just want to move to the next technique or exercise because I'm trying to practice. But I'm also trying to squeeze every bit of value out of every exercise I do, every training session I have. And sometimes to get the good juice, you have to squeeze a little harder, dig a little deeper, work a little longer in what seems to be something that you have well, to challenge your own perception of value of what that drill is giving you, what that exercise is giving you. Every time we train, every day that we come to class, we're essentially one fight ahead, one more experience ahead. And those experiences where you garner skill and you practice knowledge, right? Those experiences become invaluable over time simply because instead of, and this is why we call it a cipher, right? Instead of fighting being a mystery, right? It's an open book and it's easy to read. Last night I was teaching Dumog, and I was explaining to the students, I said, look, your opponent's going to tell you how he wants to lose. He's going to tell you, please break my arm. He's going to straighten his arm. And if you're only able to hear or perceive it, you can take what the opponent offers instead of fighting for whatever it is that you think that you want. That's the, a true expression of flow, the law of utilization. Use what's there, right? If your opponent bends his arm, he's offering his shoulder. If they swing their leg, they're offering their leg. And the adept fighter can gladly accept and utilize that opportunity for an advantage. So, as we do our training and as we become better, each day we get better, and we get better sometimes not by learning something new or practicing something that we're uncomfortable with, but testing what we think we know by fully exploring what we feel to be the comfort zone. Sometimes we're comfortable because we're not paying attention. As a former bounty hunter, the people that I associate with on a daily basis and the sense of safety that they have in various scenarios, being in the downtown area of a city, walking in through a neighborhood, right? Purchasing something at your local convenience store, or even your supermarket, and not perceiving the people around you and understanding the walk of life that they might come from and what that means for you is kind of funny to me, because my perception is very different. I see a much more dangerous world, and it's because of my time as a fugitive retrieval agent, going off and looking for people and then finding them where I find them, learning where they spend their time, where they get their smoothies, where they tend to get their coffee, which gas station they might tend to go to for gas or for cigarettes or whatever it is that they're getting on a regular basis. Understanding the nature of these people based upon their records that I have privy to and the charges that I'm pursuing them for, right? I see a different world. I have arrested people in places where I would think that neighborhood-wise, I'm like, oh, this is a nice neighborhood, nice, quiet, normal neighborhood, or at a gas station, or at a smoothie shop, in front of your big box discount store, wherever it is that they go, and we go into out of these establishments, thinking that we see things. We're just simply not awake, right? We're not perceiving the world around us. partially because we don't have an accurate set of experiences to be able to understand what it is that we're seeing and noticing. You know, I'm doing a consulting job right now for a local bar and restaurant, and they want to reduce violence inside their location, right? They want to prevent that, right? They don't have a terrible problem with it, but at the same time, for the restaurateur, the owner, and the people there, there's an element of risk. And you know, training the security professionals in such a way as to not only be able to defend themselves, which is really not what I'm going to be doing, right? But I'm going to be training them in terms of like perceiving, you know, the nature of the people around them and what their clothing or their tattoos or their behaviors might mean, right? And how to predict that and then deal that before it becomes a problem, right? Being able to perceive in a way, it awakens us to a degree. But sometimes, what's even worse in my mind is that some people are capable of fully perceiving these things and they notice these things, but because they're so commonly in it and that it's so normal for them as an experience, there's no response. They don't feel, they don't, you know, their awareness doesn't heighten. They don't change their prep level, you know. They don't have any way of behaving other than, oh yeah, I see that person there, but he ain't gonna bother me. Well, until they do. And that's all gonna be left up to you and your ability to perceive the world around you, the opponent before you, and what you're gonna have to do in order for you to be prepared and to be able to prevent and ultimately be able to prevail. And it's completely contingent upon, you know, everything that you learn in martial arts, but most especially how you have sharpened your perception. And I'll see you on the training floor.